Hello and welcome to The Briefing, with me, Tom Harwood. Now, Fridays are usually lighter on the parliamentary side of things, but the politics doesn't stop. As we speak, Boris Johnson is holding the first cabinet meeting of his new cabinet, and it will be a busy one, physically. The number of ministers attending cabinet has gone up from 27 to 29, potentially because the number of women attending cabinet has increased by 2. Well, they'll be crammed in this morning around that famous lozenge table, shoulder to shoulder like sardines. Yes, the man who became Tory leader on a promise to slim down cabinet has instead fattened it right back up. Beyond cabinet, last night we saw some significant junior ministerial appointments. Rising stars to keep an eye on for the future include 2017's Lee Rowley and Neil O'Brien. Kemi Badenoch too now straddles 3 roles, as a minister in the Housing Department, in the Foreign Office and as Equalities Minister too. Quite the portfolio. Well, away from the reshuffle, speculation is mounting that expensive PCR tests will be ditched for the double-jabbed when travelling, and the amber list may be scrapped entirely as well, with every country going red or green. A much simpler, sensible policy. Lord Frost, the Brexit supremo, has announced that laws kept on the statute book after Brexit will be improved or repealed if they do not benefit UK citizens and businesses. It's expected that the UK is looking to diverge from the EU on data protection, gene editing, clinical trials, medical devices and vehicles. Now, the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, is hosting a conference of speakers of the G7 countries. The guests, including US Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, have travelled to Hoyle's Chorley constituency for the event. And finally, it's day 1 of Liberal Democrat Party conference. Much more on that with our first guest of the show. So let's get right to it. As I mentioned, today is the first day of Lib Dem Party conference. While the party has just 12 members of parliament, it has enjoyed a recent uptick in the polls and, of course, a by-election victory. Well, in the face of Tory tax hikes, Lib Dems are attempting to park their tanks firmly in the so-called blue wall, going after southern Conservative seats like Chesham and Amersham. Last week, Lib Dem leader Ed Davey told me this was a big opportunity for his party.
The Democrats beat the Conservatives in Chesham and Amersham, which was a solid blue seat in Buckinghamshire. And it shows to me that the Liberal Democrats can beat the Conservatives in what we call blue wall seats across the south, where Liberal Democrats are in a strong second place against the Conservatives.
Well, to discuss this all with me and more, I'm delighted to be joined by Christine Jardine, the Liberal Democrat Treasury spokesman and MP for Edinburgh West. Welcome to the show, Christine. Firstly, I'm looking forward to going next week physically to the Labour Party conference. I'm looking forward the week after to going along to the Conservative Party conference in person. Why is your conference today virtual?
Well, many reasons, but, first and foremost, it had proved very popular with people from throughout the country. It improves accessibility. It doesn't matter where you live, you can be there easily. And there are still a lot of people who are shielding, who don't want to be in rooms with, several hundred people, and a lot of people who just don't feel comfortable with it yet. We also made the decision, felt we had to make the decision at a time where we gave people plenty of warning. Our recent conferences that we've had during the pandemic have been very popular doing it this way. So we see it as, a positive step. And I would actually hope that long term we might keep some aspect of this.
Does this mean that potentially the Lib Dems are more cautious on COVID than even the Labour Party now, who are, of course, holding a physical conference next week?
You say cautious, I say sensible. We're thinking about our members staying safe. We're thinking about our members having easy access to the conference, regardless of whether they live in, Bournemouth or Birmingham or, Dundee. So it's very important that people feel able to take part. And, currently a lot of people are still shielding and really they don't want to put themselves in a position of being in a physical conference. Our last conference
to do with the rumours
success
of how expensive it is to hold a party conference, that the Lib Dem finances might not be what they once were at the peak of the Brexit troubles.
Well, you know what? You can look for, different answers to everything, but the answer is that it's accessible. and it's been successful. We had more people at our last conference than ever before. And other downsides to it, yes, there are pros and cons to everything. But in the current circumstances, with so many people shielding, with so many people concerned about getting COVID-19, which you can still get, you can still carry, it just seemed the right thing to do. I'm perfectly happy with it. And most of our members, certainly the ones I've been speaking to, are perfectly happy with it. And that's the important thing, because unlike the other parties, our conference is about our members.
Now, I've been looking at some of the events that are being scheduled throughout the next few days of your conference, and interestingly, there's one talking particularly about what Lib Dems are calling the blue wall. These seats that used to be very solidly Conservative and seem to have been trending away from the Conservatives in recent years. This seems to be the major line of attack, really, for the Lib Dems now. Is this sort of where the whole party is being focused on, and how many Tory seats do you think are vulnerable?
This has come as a result of people in those Conservative seats in the south of England and elsewhere, right across the country, being fed up with being ignored, abandoned, and let down by a Conservative government, which promised them one thing and is now doing another. Small business, for example, the backbone of the country, they feel that they haven't had the support that they deserved in the pandemic. And in Chesham and Amersham, which remember was a safe Conservative seat in big quotation marks now, we were getting on the doorsteps that people just felt ignored and abandoned by the Conservatives. Now, there are a lot of seats in the country where we came second to the Conservatives, and they are now feeling that. They are now feeling that, the Liberal Democrats are offering, a better alternative than we are. And you saw this week even, Boris Johnson breaking promises on pensions, breaking promises on, social care and the National Health Service, that he wasn't going to raise taxes, that he was going to fix it. And people are just getting bored and disillusioned and feel let down by this Conservative Party.
So for people in this country who don't quite like the idea that taxes are going to be going up, that the tax burden is, by some measurements, going to be the largest it's been since the war, do you have a pitch for those voters, those former Tory voters, who are now looking elsewhere? We saw in a YouGov poll last week that other smaller parties, rather than the Labour Party, are being the beneficiaries of people looking elsewhere. Do you have a smaller state tax-cutting pitch for some of those Tory voters?
What I would say to Tory voters is that we will listen to them. Yes, we need to spend money in the NHS. The NHS needs investment, but what we need is a fair system, not this unfair national insurance hike, which the Conservatives have introduced, which will hit those who have been hardest hit in the pandemic and the low paid, the young people who've been through so much. What we will offer is a fairer system, a way that will listen to them, that will improve our education, that will improve the National Health Service, that will support the people who've been at the front line in this and who've been hardest hit throughout the pandemic.
Now, your seat of Edinburgh West was back in the day held by the Conservatives. It's a well-to-do area of Edinburgh. Your leader's seat, of course, is also sort of the Tory suburbia in London. Are you worried that really sort of all of the seats that you now hold are going to be more Tory-facing? And where in the past you've held seats like, I don't know, Sheffield Hallam, I suppose that was a bit Tory-facing as well. I'm struggling to think of many seats that the Lib Dems have held that are actually Labour-facing.
Well, you mentioned my seat in Edinburgh West and you said it used to be a Conservative seat. You're talking back before 1997. That's a long time. And at the last election, both in the general election and in the Scottish election, the Conservatives were way back in third place. If you like, my seat is not a Tory-facing seat; it's an SNP-facing seat, like a lot of seats in Scotland.
Just about every seat in Scotland.
And we are in Edinburgh West and North East Fife, in Caithness, Sutherland and Ross, and Orkney and Shetland. We are the only party, and in other parts of Scotland, actually, we are the only party who can beat the SNP. And that is exactly the same as in these places in England, in the Blue Wall in England, where we are the only party who can beat the Conservatives. People who are fed up with them, who are feeling abandoned, not listened to, they recognise that we are the only people who, if they vote for us, can defeat that Conservative MP and can make sure that in future they have a representative that will listen to them and put forward their views.
Well, Christine Jardine, Treasury spokesman for the Liberal Democrats, thank you very much for joining me on the briefing on GB News this morning, and good luck with your conference over the next few days. Well, the great divergence is on its way. When we left the EU, the UK transposed EU law into UK law to ensure a smooth transition. Now ministers have the job of painstakingly unpicking the damaging regulations and replacing them with rules that work for Britain. Hopefully, we will move in a direction that is more liberal, less overbearing, and one that delivers more personal responsibility and freedom of action. To many, regulatory divergence was the big prize of Brexit, ditching growth-hampering and unscientific regulations from GDPR to gene editing, from cookie pop-ups to financial services. Well, to help unpick all of this now is the man who was once described as the brains of Brexit. Shankar Singham is the CEO of Competair and former trade advisor to the US Trade Representative and the UK Trade Secretary. Welcome to the show, Shankar. Firstly, how realistic is it that we are genuinely going to get now a bonfire of these EU regulations?
Well, I'm not sure about a bonfire of regulations, but I think this is an incredibly important announcement that Lord Frost made in Parliament yesterday. It pursues the agenda that has been set out really from the beginning of this process, which is, in order to have a successful economic outcome here for the UK, you need to maximise your opportunities and minimise the disruptions of leaving the EU. And as you pointed out, the great prize of Brexit comes from two things. One is your external trade policy, and of course Liz Truss and prior to her Liam Fox and now Anne-Marie Trevelyan. They've done a very good job on external trade policy. Where there's been a bit of a gap so far has been domestic regulatory reform. So we're not diverging from European regulation just for the sake of divergence. We're diverging in order to grow the UK economy. And the name of the game there is to lower the levels of market distortions and market distorting regulation in the UK. That doesn't mean, deregulation. It doesn't mean we're getting rid of lots of regulations. It means we're going to have better regulations. As Lord Frost said yesterday, much of the regulation that you've seen in Europe is a one-size-fits-all model. It doesn't necessarily make sense for the UK. Frankly, it doesn't actually often make sense for the EU either in terms of economic growth. So I think what we're going to see is, can we improve the way we regulate? And Lord Frost talked about this yesterday. Can we have a more scientific way of promulgating regulations? So you actually look at the market impact of them, you look at the trade impact of them, and you try to regulate in such a way that damages trade and damages economic competition as little as possible. So you might have lots of different regulatory responses to a particular problem, some of which damage trade and damage the market significantly, and some of which don't. And you'd actually have an attempt to produce regulations that damage the market as little as possible. We've never really done that before.
Interesting to me that so many of these EU regulations, and although the EU and particularly the Commission is really promoted as being this great technocratic institution, its great criticism and its great benefit, I suppose, to many people is it's insulated from sort of the whims of voters to a larger extent. But it seems to me that so many of these damaging regulations are actually captured by interest groups. And I'm thinking particularly about GMOs, about gene editing, about the real forefront of scientific advancement, where the UK has a genuine opportunity to become a world leader. And the EU seems to have been captured by a lot of fairly unscientific interests in this field. Do you think that there's a real genuine opportunity here to become this scientific powerhouse?
Yeah, well, I think there are certain things you want to do if you want to genuinely be a scientific tech powerhouse, which I think you're right. I think the UK has the potential to be that. There's only a handful of countries in the world that can have that aspiration. Obviously, the US is one, but I think the UK is right up there. But if you look at GDPR, which Lord Frost mentioned yesterday. it is almost impossible to conceive of being a technology superpower with GDPR-style regulation, because what that does is it prioritizes privacy over data flow. Now, no one is saying that privacy is, should be thrown out the window. Of course, privacy is important, but getting the balance right is the critical thing. And I would argue that GDPR swings that balance more towards privacy. And everyone wants the technology, the benefits of high-tech companies and having your vital data being read well, so that you can be diagnosed, so that you can have better health. Everyone wants this, but you can't have that if you restrict data flow. So he's going to move, or the suggestion is that we're going to move away from that type of approach and move more into a world where we talk to countries about having adequacy rules and mutual recognition and those kinds of things between regimes that are slightly different. So data is one thing. Clinical trials was mentioned yesterday. GMO you just mentioned, and that was mentioned yesterday as well. There's a whole range of technology where we can have better regulation. And in terms of how you avoid the capture that you're talking about, which is absolutely right. There's a lot of capture in Brussels. There's a lot of capture generally in ministries. Is you have to set up a system where the entrepreneurs, the small businesses that your previous guest was talking about, actually have a voice in this process. And their voice is basically one that comes from competition and allowing competitive forces to decide market outcomes. And that is the critical thing. And that's what your regulatory system has to deliver. And if it delivers that, then you'll create wealth into your economy, you'll create jobs, you'll create economic growth. And that's how we're actually ultimately going to grow out of the COVID crisis. We're not going to grow through government spending.
Huge prize to be won there. Shankar Singham, thank you very much for joining us on the briefing this morning. A very important point about not replicating those sort of institutional captures that have gone on in Brussels back here at home. Well, while we've been talking about some of the larger prizes of regulatory divergence, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about potentially one of the smaller ones. One of those new Brexit freedoms widely reported this morning is the government is looking to allow shops, supermarkets and market stalls to sell their goods in imperial units. This has been met with scorn and derision online, with people performatively wailing that they will not be able to understand what they're buying anymore. Clearly, these people have never inched towards buying another pint, gone the extra mile or piled on the pounds after eating tons of food over Christmas. I quite like the imperfection of the imperial system. I'll always be 6 foot or thereabouts, rather than 182.8 centimetres. But if you want to measure yourself in centimetres, be my guest. Just don't fine the man running the market stall for selling a pound of beef instead of 0.4535 kilograms of the stuff. It amazes me that people are getting outraged by choice. Isn't it crazy to allow shops to sell... It isn't crazy to allow shops to sell units that they want to sell in. What is crazy is that under EU law, shops are forbidden by law from using whatever units they want. Most will obviously continue to use the far less fun metric system, but finally, those who choose not to will no longer be punished. Someone asked me on Twitter, what's the point of giving shops the ability to use units which aren't taught in schools? Which is entirely the wrong starting point. The starting point in these discussions must always be, what is the point in the state intervening to stop someone doing what they want to do? And banning a system of measurement for the apparent purpose of continental unity does not, in my view, meet the very high bar required for legislation. So yes, time to scrap the EU's British measurements ban. This won't be the most significant regulatory reform by any stretch, but something not being hugely significant is no reason to avoid doing the right thing. Inch by inch, Britain will become freer. Now, a commentator I hugely respect on COVID matters, who has written some first-rate stuff on the subject, is Christopher Snowdon. He's head of lifestyle economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Yesterday, he tweeted that there is, quote, no sign of any media outlets reporting another fall in cases today. So I was quite keen to put this right. Here's the data. And as you can see, there it is. Cases have begun tumbling now for just over a week. We can see that they were rising very gently and now they're falling again after that big drop-off just about stage 4 of reopening. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Christopher Snowdon himself, who noticed that not many other media organisations have been pointing out the good news on COVID. Why do you think that is, Chris?
I really don't know. I mean, there's a huge amount of statistical illiteracy amongst journalists that has really been quite obvious in the last 18 months, and it's not been getting any better, despite the fact that the various quirks of the statistics are really quite obvious now. For example, we know that on a Tuesday and a Wednesday, we're going to get a much larger number of deaths reported than we will do at the weekend, or indeed the rest of the week. And that's just because we don't get much done at the weekend. The NHS doesn't really do that much a lot of the time at the weekend. So there's a lag. We know there's a lag. And yet, every Tuesday and Wednesday, the media will go crazy about some exceptionally high number of deaths to make it look as if the number of deaths is skyrocketing upwards. In actual fact, the number of deaths now is flat and possibly declining. Case numbers are falling really quite rapidly. There's been a 22% drop in the last week in the UK. We had a small upwards blip, really, when we started all the mass testing in schools, when the schools went back. That was to be expected. It was actually quite a lot smaller than people did expect. And it's now in decline. And this is really important stuff because it obviously has an effect on hospitalizations and the number of deaths. And we were, not that long ago, by which I mean like 2 weeks ago, we were kind of nudging up towards 30,000 cases a day being reported in England. We're now closer to 20,000. Once you get down towards 20,000, you actually see the number of people in hospital with COVID dropping. If we can hold it at this level, let alone go down further, we will see the hospitals gradually emptying out. This is really good news. And yet I don't see very much interest in it. In the odd occasion when it is reported, it's misreported. But generally speaking, the BBC in particular, I think, is bad on this. They either don't report the good news or they don't put it in any proper context. They just tell you how many cases there are without telling you how many there were, the previous week. So, we know now that cases from this kind of mini wave we've had with the schools reopening, it peaked on September the 6th. That's quite a while away. We've had at least 9 days of successive week-on-week declines. I'm not saying this is going to continue. I don't know. I'm not going to make any predictions. I don't know what's going to happen. They could rocket up tomorrow, for all I know. I don't think anyone knows, including Sage. And yet the media focuses on some pretty outlandish kind of worst-case scenarios from Sage without telling us what's actually going on now. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I do know what's going on now, and so do the journalists. The data is really good on this. It's publicly available. You've just shown one of the graphs there. Anyone can go online and find this stuff out. But we've got dropping hospital admissions. We've got a reduction in the number of people in hospital with COVID, which is really important. We've probably got, I think now, a decline in deaths, and we've certainly got a drop in case numbers. And this should be the main story, because it's a good news story.
It certainly is a good news story. And of course, you mentioned there the BBC. I think someone linked me to a discussion that they had on one of their programmes yesterday where people said that cases were rising, completely unchallenged. Now, I don't think that they were being malicious. I think they probably just weren't looking at the data over the last week. And really, there's got to be a corrective here. And I really respect your commentary on this because, of course, you are the absolute unmitigated slayer of the COVID sceptics when it comes to people who make outrageous claims about this pandemic being over, or at least being over last year and all that sort of stuff. You absolutely put them to task. But you also put to task the people who say that COVID is getting much, much worse, who have all these doom-mongering predictions. And it's wonderful to have this sort of COVID centrism here presented, because what really is the case, isn't it, that we are going to see cases sort of bumbling up and down. We're going to see deaths at probably a societal, acceptable level. Yes, it's going to be very sad for every family involved, but probably not enough to justify really harsh restrictions this winter.
Well, I don't know for sure. I suspect you're probably right on that. I don't think things are going to get colossally bad in the winter, but the cases may well rise. They may well fall to a very low level. I mean, they're at a very low level in a lot of European countries, and they're not doing that much differently to what the UK is doing. We simply don't know. But we, as I said, we do know what's going on at the moment. I saw Professor John Edmonds, who's on Sage and has been wrong again and again throughout this pandemic, that still gets invited back onto the television. He was on the Peston show a couple of nights ago, and he said that nobody expects cases to fall in the immediate future. They'd already been falling 8 successive days by the time he went on television to say that. I don't understand why he would do that. He must be familiar with the data. There's I think a combination of problems here. Firstly, bad news sells and good news doesn't. That's just a rule of journalism. Certainly, a lot of journalists simply don't have the statistical nous to understand what's going on or to challenge people when they say things about COVID that are not correct. And the net result is that either people are kind of systematically misinformed or they're certainly given the impression that things are getting worse. And the media might not always necessarily explicitly say cases are going up, but you can't blame some people for kind of inferring that, from kind of assuming that must be the case from the way everyone's going on about it. The story really with COVID in the last week has been case numbers unexpectedly falling by quite a significant amount, but the story in the media by and large has been Sage says there's going to be 7,000 hospital admissions a day or whatever crazy prediction they made. We're probably going to be looking at another lockdown. Everything's dreadful. Winter's coming. We're the worst country in Europe. I mean, this is not an accurate picture, and it's been happening since day one.
Yeah, and I thank you, Chris, because I hope this has provided a little bit of a corrective to that miserable picture that we've been hearing elsewhere. Thank you very much for coming on the show to provide your insight there, and the fact that in so many of these cases, we don't know, but things look just about okay. Well, that's it for this edition of The Briefing. I'll be back at the same time on Monday, and coming up, Patrick and Anaya will be here with the latest on the AUKUS Pact. But first, here's the weather.
Good morning.